Helicopter crew. Films. Giant Bigfoot, dragging a human body across the river. That's the exact headline that spread through our base in Alaska back in the late 90s. A helicopter crew, on a routine flight along the Kuskokwim River, captured something no one should ever see. Through the fog, the camera caught a massive upright figure, broad shoulders, nearly 8 feet tall, pulling what looked like a lifeless body across the gravel shallows. At first, they thought it was a bear, but the thermal camera told a different story. The heat signature was too big, too human-shaped, and it moved into the tree line with an unnatural speed. The stench of wet copper and musk even reached the cockpit as they hovered overhead. The footage vanished into official storage. The incident was written off as animal activity. Yet the crew remembers every detail, and one man kept a hidden copy no one was supposed to see. If the forest can swallow evidence this easily, what else is it hiding, and how many missing people were never lost at all? Let me know in the comments which city or country you're listening from. If you like stories that connect us, don't forget to subscribe before you leave. I never planned on sharing this story. Even now, after more than 20 years since I left my position as a flight engineer in Alaska, I find myself hesitating. The events I'm about to describe have stayed with me, lurking in the back of my mind like shadows in peripheral vision. But I suppose some burdens become heavier the longer you carry them alone. From 1991 through 1998, I worked maintaining and operating helicopter systems for various contracts across Alaska's vast wilderness. Most of our missions involve supplying remote research stations, supporting search and rescue operations, or conducting aerial surveys for wildlife management. It was demanding work that required absolute precision. When you're flying hundreds of miles from the nearest settlement in temperatures that can freeze hydraulic fluid, there's zero room for error. My background was military, 8 years in the Air Force working on cargo planes before transitioning to civilian aviation. I'd seen my share of unusual situations, but nothing in my training prepared me for what happened during that fall season in 1996. Even now, I can recall every detail with unsettling clarity, though I've spent years trying to forget. The company I worked for at the time specialized in contracts with scientific research, teams and government agencies. We operated a small fleet of Bell 412 helicopters, sturdy twin-engine machines equipped for the harsh Alaskan environment. My role involved not just maintaining the aircraft's systems, but also operating specialized equipment. During flights, thermal imaging cameras, tracking devices, and various scientific instruments our clients required. I was good at my job, methodical, detail-oriented, the kind of person who triple-checks every reading and keeps immaculate logs. That's probably why this particular incident bothers me so much, because it defies the rational, systematic approach I've applied to every other aspect of my career. What I'm about to share isn't just another tale of strange lights in the sky or unexplained noises in the wilderness. I have documentation, flight logs, instrument readings, and even footage that I've never shown anyone. Until now, only 3 other people knew about what we encountered that day, and we all agreed to keep quiet. Not because anyone ordered us to, but because none of us could face the ridicule or the questions we couldn't answer. I'm breaking that silence now because I recently learned that one of my former colleagues passed away. His death made me realize that if all of us take this to our graves, something important might be lost. Something that people working in those remote areas should know about. Not to frighten them, but to prepare them. The events I'm about to describe took place during what should have been a routine survey flight near the Yukon border. We were testing new thermal imaging equipment for a wildlife study, tracking moose populations in an area that had recently seen unusual migration patterns. The weather that morning was clear but cold, -15 degrees Fahrenheit with light winds from the northwest. Perfect flying conditions for that time of year. I remember checking my logbook before takeoff, noting the time as 0700 hours. The sun was just beginning to rise, painting the snow-covered peaks in shades of pink and gold. Everything seemed normal, routine. We had no way of knowing that in less than 6 hours, our understanding of what exists in Alaska's vast wilderness would be permanently altered. Note, this opening section establishes the narrator's credibility, sets the time period and location, and creates the foundation for the events to follow, all while maintaining a professional, matter-of-fact tone consistent with the character's background. The contract that brought me to the Kuskokwim River region wasn't particularly unusual for Alaska. The state's Department of Natural Resources needed reliable helicopter support for their ranger stations dotted along the river's meandering path. These outposts, some of them little more than reinforced cabins with radio equipment, served as vital lifelines in an area where the nearest town might be hundreds of miles away. Our primary base of operations was a small airfield just outside of McGrath, though we frequently staged from makeshift landing zones closer to our delivery points. The work followed a predictable pattern during the summer months: supply runs, equipment transfers, and the occasional emergency medical evacuation. But as autumn approached and daylight hours grew shorter, the job became more challenging. The Kuskokwim River Valley is unforgiving territory. The river itself stretches over 700 miles, cutting through some of the most isolated wilderness in North America. The surrounding landscape is a maze of tributary streams, dense spruce forests, and rolling hills that can disorient even experienced pilots. During my time there, I learned to respect how quickly conditions could change. Clear skies could transform into whiteout conditions within minutes, and GPS coordinates that looked straightforward on a map could lead you into narrow valleys with barely enough room to maneuver. We serviced 6 ranger stations along a 200-mile stretch of the river. Each station had its own particular challenges. Some required precise approaches through tight corridors of trees, while others sat exposed on ridgelines where crosswinds could make landings treacherous. The rangers stationed at these outposts were a hardy bunch, often spending weeks or months in isolation. They relied on our deliveries not just for supplies, but also for their connection to the outside world. Search and rescue operations added another layer of complexity to our work. The Kuskokwim region sees its share of missing persons cases: hunters who stray too far from their camps, snowmobilers who misjudge the weather, or sometimes just people who underestimate the vastness of the Alaskan wilderness. When these calls came in, we'd work closely with the ranger teams, using our helicopters' capabilities to cover ground that would take days to search on foot. The terrain itself seemed designed to swallow people whole. Dense stands of black spruce created shadows that could hide anything larger than a moose. The numerous tributary valleys and drainages offered countless places where someone, or something, could remain hidden from aerial observation. Even with thermal imaging equipment, searching effectively required intimate knowledge of the land and its quirks. I remember one of the senior rangers, Dave Matthews, telling me during a supply run that the Kuskokwim had a way of making you feel watched. It's not just the isolation, he'd said, checking off items on his inventory list. There's something about these valleys, like they're holding on to secrets. At the time, I'd dismissed his comments as the kind of mystical talk that long-time wilderness dwellers often indulge in. Looking back now, I wish I'd paid more attention to what he was trying to tell me. The unpredictability of our work schedule meant we needed to be ready to fly at a moment's notice. Weather windows could be brief, and in emergency situations, every minute counted. We kept our Bell 412 helicopter meticulously maintained, knowing that mechanical failure in this environment could have fatal consequences. During summer months, our crew settled into a comfortable rhythm. There were 3 of us who regularly flew together. Jack, our pilot, who'd been flying these routes since the early 80s. Tommy, our loadmaster, fresh out of training and eager to prove himself. And me, keeping the systems running and managing our documentation. Jack was the kind of pilot you wanted in Alaska. Methodical, never taking unnecessary risks. He had this habit of tapping his altimeter twice before every takeoff, a superstition he'd picked up during his military days. His weather-beaten face had seen every kind of storm the region could throw at us, and his instincts about sudden weather changes had saved our lives more than once. Tommy, being the youngest, caught most of our good-natured ribbing. He was 23, built like a linebacker, and could secure a cargo load faster than anyone I'd worked with. Despite his size, He had this nervous energy about him, always checking and rechecking his knots, muttering calculations under his breath. We teased him about it, but truthfully, that attention to detail made him invaluable. Our days followed a predictable pattern. We'd meet at 0400 hours, review weather reports and flight plans over coffee that could strip paint, and run through our pre-flight checks with the precision of a well-oiled machine. The helicopter, a Bell 212, became our second home. We knew every rattle, every quirk in her systems. Between supply runs, we'd swap stories over military-issue MREs. Jack would reminisce about close calls in weather that would ground most pilots. Tommy would share his dreams of eventually getting his pilot's license, while I'd bore them with technical details about engine maintenance that only I found fascinating. But it was during our radio checks with the ranger stations that the first hints of something off began to surface. That spring, we'd heard increasing chatter about missing trappers, not entirely unusual for the region. Alaska's wilderness had a way of swallowing people whole, but the frequency was notable. I remember one afternoon in particular, early June, when we were dropping supplies at the McGrath station. Ranger Peterson, a veteran of 15 years in the region, was helping us unload. He was usually quick with a joke, but that day something had him subdued. Had another trapper radioing about destroyed lines, he mentioned, almost casually. Third one this month. Says whatever's doing it is systematic, not your typical bear behavior. Tommy, stacking supply crates, piped up. Could be wolves, right? Had a pack causing trouble near Aniak last season. Peterson just shook his head, his eyes distant. Some things the forest keeps to itself, he said quietly. Been here long enough to know when something's different. He wouldn't elaborate further, but his words stuck with me. The isolation began weighing more heavily after that. Flying over the endless expanse of wilderness, I'd catch Tommy staring intently into the trees below, as if searching for something. Even Jack, usually focused entirely on his instruments and flight path, would occasionally scan the tree line with unusual intensity. Our jokes became a shield against the growing unease. We'd mock each other's jumpiness, make up ridiculous explanations for the missing trappers, anything to maintain that sense of normalcy. But in the quiet moments, when the rotor wash died down and we were surrounded by nothing but wilderness, we all felt it. Something in the atmosphere had shifted, like the forest itself was holding its breath. The morning of August 23rd, 1994, started like any other supply run. I remember checking the weather reports 3 times before takeoff, watching the mist roll off the Kuskokwim River in thick, ghostly sheets. Jack was already in the cockpit when I arrived, his usual morning coffee replaced by intense focus on the pre-flight checklist. Visibility's dropping fast, I said, settling into my station. Maybe we should wait it out. Jack shook his head. Rangers at Station 4 are running low on supplies. Weather's only getting worse this week. It's now or never. Tommy secured the last of the cargo in back, giving us a thumbs up through the small window. He was 23, still green enough to get excited about every flight, but even he seemed subdued that morning. Something about the air felt different, heavier, more pressing. We lifted off at 7:15, the helicopter's rotors cutting through layers of fog that clung to the treetops like wet cotton. Usually, we'd maintain an altitude of about 1,000 feet, following the river's general course while staying well above the terrain. But that day, the ceiling kept pushing us lower and lower. 500 feet, I called out, monitoring our instruments. 400, Jack's jaw tightened. Going to have to follow the river. Keep your eyes peeled for power lines. The forest seemed to crowd in around us as we descended, ancient spruce and hemlock rising like dark sentinels through the mist. The normally chatty Tommy remained silent in the back, and I found myself holding my breath during the longer stretches, listening to nothing but the steady thrum of our rotors echoing off the canyon walls. 300 feet now, I reported, watching our altimeter with growing unease. Visibility about half a mile ahead. The river below us twisted like a black ribbon through the wilderness, its surface occasionally visible through gaps in the fog. We were flying slower than usual, much slower, and the forest seemed different at this height, More intimate, more alive. The spaces between the trees were deeper, darker than they should have been. Anyone else notice how quiet the radio's been? Tommy finally spoke up from the back, his voice barely audible over the engine noise. He was right. Usually, there'd be regular chatter, other pilots reporting positions, rangers checking in, weather updates from various stations. But that morning, the radio offered nothing but static, punctuated by our own position reports that nobody acknowledged. Probably the weather, Jack said, but I caught him glancing at the radio with concern. Interference from the cloud cover. I kept my eyes locked on the instruments, calling out readings mechanically, trying to ignore the way the forest seemed to press in closer with each passing minute. The mist created strange patterns in the trees, shapes that would form and dissolve before you could focus on them properly. 275 feet, I announced, my throat feeling unusually dry. Fuel at 85%, 23 miles to Station 4. The helicopter's vibrations transmitted through my seat, up my spine, settling somewhere in my chest, like a second heartbeat. We were all feeling it, that instinctive urge to be anywhere but here, flying low through fog that shouldn't have been this thick, this persistent, this alive. Tommy's earlier observation about the radio silence had struck a nerve. In all my years of flying these routes, I'd never experienced such a complete communications blackout. Even in the worst weather, you'd catch fragments of conversations, bits of static-filled chatter. But this silence felt deliberate, as if the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting. Visibility's dropping fast, I said, settling into my station. Maybe we should delay until it clears. Weather's only getting worse according to the forecast, Jack replied, his weathered face illuminated by the instrument panel. Better now than later. Mike, our loadmaster, nodded in agreement from behind us, already securing his harness. We lifted off at 7:15 in the morning, the Bell 212 vibrating familiar beneath us as we climbed through the murk. The river appeared and disappeared beneath us like a silver thread through cotton, forcing us to fly lower than usual, maybe 400 feet up. The forest pressed in on both sides, dark spruce and hemlock creating an endless corridor of green. 2 hours into the flight, Mike's voice crackled through the intercom. Movement on the gravel bar, 10 o'clock low. I shifted in my seat, scanning the wide stretch of river-smooth stones below. At first I thought it was just another bear. We'd seen plenty over the years, usually fishing or scavenging, but something about this was different. Jack, can we swing around? I asked, already reaching for the mounted camera system we used for reconnaissance work. Something's not right down there. The helicopter banked gently, giving us a better angle. Through the camera's viewfinder, I could make out a large, dark figure. It was upright. That's what had caught my attention. Bears rear up occasionally, but this thing stayed vertical, moving with purpose across the gravel bar. That's no bear, Mike muttered. Too tall too. Deliberate. He was right. The figure was dragging something. I couldn't make out what, leaving a dark trail across the pale stones. Its movements were smooth, calculated, nothing like a bear's lumbering gait. I estimated its height at over 7 feet, though the mist made precise judgment difficult. Getting it on camera? Jack asked, maintaining a steady hover despite the swirling winds off the river. Rolling, I confirmed, adjusting the focus. The figure stopped moving, and for a moment, I swear it looked up at us. The mist parted just enough to reveal broad shoulders, a massive head set directly on those shoulders with no discernible neck. Then, with surprising speed, it turned and moved into the tree line, dragging its burden with it. Follow it? Mike suggested, but Jack shook his head. Fuel's too low for detours, and this weather's not giving us any breaks. Mark the coordinates. I noted our position, double-checking the GPS reading as the gravel bar disappeared behind us. The only evidence something had been there was that dark trail across the stones, already being erased by the light rain that had started to fall. Anyone want to be the first to say it? Mike asked after a few minutes of tense silence. Let's stick to what we actually saw, Jack replied firmly. Dark figure, upright, approximately 7 to 8 feet tall, dragging an unidentified object. That's what goes in the log, nothing more. I kept the camera rolling for another few minutes, but the mist had thickened again, turning the world, beyond our windscreen, into a grey void. The coordinates and footage were all we had, that and the unsettling certainty that we'd witnessed something that didn't fit into any normal category of wildlife encounters. Through the swirling mist, I caught movement on the gravel bar below. At first, I assumed it was just another bear. We'd seen plenty during our flights. But something about this made my hands freeze on the clipboard. "Jack, 3 o'clock, about 200 yards ahead on the riverbank," I called out, my voice steadier than I felt. The pilot banked slightly, giving us a better view. Through the rotor wash pushing away patches of fog, we could make out a figure that defied explanation. It stood upright, impossibly tall against the tree line, with shoulders that seemed as broad as our cargo door. The thing was bent forward, clearly struggling with something heavy. "Get the thermal up," Jack ordered, his usual gruff tone tinged with tension. I flipped the switch, and the FLIR camera whirred to life. The infrared image crystallized on my monitor, and I felt my throat go dry. That's not right," I muttered, adjusting the gain. The heat signature blazed on the screen, far hotter and larger than any known wildlife in the region. I'd seen plenty of bears, moose, even the occasional wolf pack on thermal, but this was different. The core temperature reading was off the charts. Then we saw what it was dragging. "Is that?" Mike's voice cracked from behind us. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. The shape being hauled across the gravel was unmistakably human-sized and human-shaped. The creature stopped, and even through the fog and distance, I could swear it turned to look directly at us. The thermal image showed its head pivot, tracking our position with unsettling precision. "We need to call this in," I said, reaching for the radio, but Jack's hand shot out, stopping me. "Wait," he said, knuckles white on the cyclic. "Think about what we're seeing. Think about what we're about to report." "There's someone down there," Mike argued. If that's a body, they're already dead," Jack cut in. "And if we report this, our careers are over. Who's going to believe what that camera's showing us?" I watched the thermal display, transfixed. The figure was moving again, but faster now, purposeful. Its heat signature suggested a mass that would have put it at 8 feet tall, minimum. The strength needed to drag an adult human body with such ease. "We can't just leave," I protested, but my voice sounded hollow even to my own ears. The fog was thickening, creating a natural veil between us and whatever was happening below. "Make your choice now," Jack said tersely. "Fuel's not infinite, and this weather's turning. We pursue this. We're committing to something none of us might walk away from. We turn back, we file a normal flight plan, and we never speak of this again." The thermal image showed the figure reaching the tree line. In seconds, it would disappear into the forest canopy, taking its grisly burden with it. The heat signature was so intense, it seemed to make the screen glow. I glanced at Mike, saw the conflict on his face that must have mirrored my own. The loadmaster just shook his head, leaving the decision to us up front. Jack's hand tightened, on the controls, waiting for my call. Below us, the gravel bar was already being swallowed by fog, like nature itself was trying to erase what we'd witnessed. The thermal imaging display cast an eerie green glow across the cockpit as Mike, our pilot, eased the collective to bring us into a slow circle. The massive figure below remained in frame, its heat signature blazing against the cool gravel bar. Even through the camera's grainy feed, I could make out defined shoulders and a distinctly bipedal stance that sent ice through my veins. "Keep it steady," I called out, fighting to keep my voice level as I adjusted the camera's focus. The loadmaster, Danny, had gone completely silent behind us. A first in the 2 years I'd known him, but before we could complete our arc, the figure's head snapped up, a deliberate, almost human-like motion that made my skin crawl. In one fluid movement, it grabbed what it had been dragging and lunged toward the tree line. The speed was wrong. Nothing that size should move that quickly. 1 second it was there, heat signature burning bright on our display, And the next, it had vanished into the dense forest canopy. "Jesus Christ," Mike whispered, his knuckles white on the controls. "Did you see how fast?" "Get us lower," I said, though every instinct screamed against it. "We need to document what's down there." Mike brought the helicopter down to about 50 feet above the gravel bar, fighting the swirling river mist. The rotor wash cleared enough of the fog to give us a clear view of the scene below. Deep grooves scarred the gravel where whatever it was had been dragging its burden. Scattered stones and debris created a chaotic pattern leading to the forest's edge, like something from a crime scene photo. That's when it hit us. The smell. Even over the familiar sense of aviation fuel and hydraulic fluid, an overwhelming stench invaded the cockpit. It was like wet fur and copper pennies, with an underlying muskiness that made my eyes water. The odor was so dense it felt like something you could cut with a knife. "What the hell is that?" Danny gagged from the back. I could hear him fumbling with the air vents. "Get us out of here," I said, unable to shake the feeling that we were being watched from the tree line. "We've seen enough." Mike didn't need to be told twice. He pulled back on the collective, lifting us away from the gravel bar. But that smell, it clung to everything. Even as we gained altitude and distance, the metallic musky stench seemed to have saturated our clothes, our skin, the very fabric of the helicopter's interior. We flew in tense silence for several minutes, each lost in our own thoughts. The forest below seemed darker somehow, more forbidding. The usual chatter of weather updates and fuel calculations felt trivial in the wake of what we'd just witnessed. "We need to report this," Danny finally said, his voice still shaky. "Search and rescue needs to know." "Report what exactly?" Mike asked. But I could tell from his tone, he was trying to convince himself more than us. That we saw something big drag something else into the woods? That we smelled something bad? They'll think we're crazy. I stared at the thermal cameras, footage, now showing nothing but the empty river valley below. The image of that massive figure was burned into my memory, the impossible speed, the deliberate movements, the way it had seemed to sense us watching. Whatever we'd seen on that gravel bar defied explanation, but the evidence was there. The gouged earth, the scattered stones, and that unforgettable stench that still lingered in our nostrils. The return flight felt endless. Our usual easy banter had evaporated, replaced by a thick silence broken only by the rhythmic thrum of rotor blades and occasional static-filled radio checks. I kept my eyes fixed on the thermal imaging display, rewinding and replaying the footage. Each viewing made my stomach knot tighter. "It had to be someone in a suit," Tommy, our loadmaster, finally blurted out. His voice carried that forced confidence people use when trying to convince themselves more than others. "Probably some hunter playing games. You know how people get out here, alone too long." He fidgeted with his harness straps, a nervous habit I'd never seen from him before. Mike's response from the pilot seat was barely audible over the engine noise. "No man moves like that. Not with that kind of weight." He kept his eyes straight ahead, knuckles white on the controls. "Did you see how fast it cleared that gravel bar? Had to be what? 40 feet in 3 seconds, while dragging—" He left the sentence unfinished. I focused on the footage again, frame by frame. The silhouette stood unnaturally tall against the tree line, its broad shoulders hunched forward as it moved. What disturbed me most was the way it carried its burden. Not like someone struggling with dead weight, but with the casual strength of a person carrying a grocery bag. The limp form, in its grasp, swayed with each stride, one arm clearly visible, dangling. "Look at the heat signature," I said, pointing to the display. "That's not a suit. Whatever this is, its core temperature is well over 100 degrees Fahrenheit. The bright white-hot center of the figure pulsed on screen, surrounded by cooler oranges and reds that no insulated costume could produce. Tommy leaned away from the screen. "Maybe the camera's malfunctioning. These things get glitchy all the time in the cold." "Equipment was calibrated this morning," I replied quietly. "You know that. You helped me run the checks." The loadmaster slumped back in his seat, the forced, skepticism draining from his face. We all knew what properly functioning thermal imaging looked like. This was something else entirely. Mike broke his silence again. That smell, you both caught it, right? He swallowed hard. Like rust and, I don't know, something else. Never smelled anything like that around a bear or moose kill. I nodded, though he couldn't see it from the pilot's seat. The odor had been distinct, metallic and musky, with an underlying sweetness that made my throat constrict. It had lingered in the cabin even after we'd gained altitude, clinging to our flight. Suits and gear, suits and gear. As we approached base, I rewound the footage one final time. The blurred figure filled the frame, its movements fluid despite its massive size. Then came that moment of awareness, when it suddenly straightened and turned toward our helicopter. Even through the grainy thermal image, there was something unsettlingly deliberate in that motion. Within seconds, it had vanished into the tree line, taking its grim cargo with it. The three of us had seen plenty of strange things during our years of flying these remote routes. Weather phenomena, wildlife behavior, optical illusions, all part of the job. But this was different. This had weight, purpose, intelligence. Tommy had stopped trying to rationalize it. Mike's usual stoic demeanor had cracked, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we'd witnessed something that was never meant to be seen, something that would follow us long after we touched down. The footage weighed on us like a physical thing. Within 48 hours of our return, word had spread through the ranger stations along the Kuskokwim, not in official reports. No one wanted to put their name on paper next to what we'd seen, but in hushed conversations over coffee and crackling radios after hours. It was Sandra Whitaker, a senior ranger at Station 6, who first connected our sighting to an open investigation. They'd been looking into reports of a possible drowning upstream, maybe a hunter who'd tried crossing at the wrong spot. The timing and location lined up uncomfortably well with what we'd captured on thermal. "We're mounting a ground search," she told me over the radio. "Given what your crew reported, we'd appreciate having someone familiar with the exact location. Would you be willing to assist?" I agreed, though my stomach knotted at the thought of walking those banks. The next morning, I joined a team of 4 rangers at first light. The weather had cleared enough for decent visibility, but a heavy mist still clung to the water. We started at the gravel bar where we'd spotted the figure, now partly submerged by the river's rising level. The first 2 days yielded nothing beyond some scattered debris, a torn piece of canvas that might have been from a tent, a single boot, print too degraded to make anything of. But on the third morning, pushing further into the brush that lined the western bank, we found the tracks. They came in pairs, pressed deep into the mud of a small clearing about 30 yards from the water. Each impression was nearly 16 inches long and 8 inches wide at the ball of the foot. What struck me wasn't just their size, but the weight required to sink that deep into packed earth. The stride length between pairs measured over 6 feet. "Bear," suggested Tom, one of the younger rangers, but his voice lacked conviction. We all knew bear tracks, and these showed clear arch and toe definitions that were unsettlingly human-like. About 200 yards further in, following the general direction of the tracks, we discovered the structure. At first, it looked like storm damage had created a natural lean-to of fallen trees. But as we drew closer, the deliberate nature of its construction became impossible to ignore. Branches as thick as my thigh had been woven together in an intricate lattice, creating a shelter roughly 12 feet high at its apex. The engineering required to interlock such heavy wood defied casual explanation. Small saplings had been bent and twisted around larger branches, their still green leaves suggesting this was recent work. Sandra documented everything with her camera, while maintaining professional detachment. But I noticed how she kept one hand near her sidearm, and how the team unconsciously tightened their formation as we examined the site. "This goes in the official record as a possible transient camp," she finally announced, though her expression said otherwise. "We'll mark it for follow-up investigation." I watched her fill out her notepad, choosing words carefully, sanitizing what we'd found into something that wouldn't raise too many questions. I understood. Who would believe the alternative? that something large enough to manhandle trees, intelligent, enough to weave them into shelter was moving through these woods. The rangers completed their search pattern over the next 2 days, but we found nothing else significant. No body, no definitive evidence of what we'd seen from the air. Just those massive tracks slowly dissolving in the mud, and that bizarre structure standing as a silent testament to something that shouldn't exist. Sandra Whitaker pulled me aside after the initial briefing, her weathered face tight with concern. "We've had 3 reports of possible drownings in this stretch over the past 18 months, she explained, spreading a topographical map across the metal desk. But no bodies recovered. The current patterns don't support that many people just washing downstream. I shared our thermal footage, though the quality had degraded significantly during the transfer to their equipment. Sandra studied each frame carefully, her expression neutral, but her knuckles white against the desk edge. The next morning, I joined a 4-person ranger team heading to the gravel bar. The weather had cleared, but the autumn chill bit through my jacket as we trudged along the riverbank. Lead Ranger Marcus Chen insisted on documenting everything by protocol, though I could tell the formal language in his notepad strained to contain what we were finding. "Natural debris pattern," he wrote, even as we stared at a series of deep impressions in the mud, paired depressions that seemed to stride up from the water's edge. Each print was nearly 16 inches long, with clear toe marks splayed wide, as if under enormous weight. They weren't bear tracks. I'd seen plenty of those. These showed a distinct arch, more like a massive human foot. "Could be overlapping prints," Chen muttered, photographing each depression. "Bears sometimes step in their own tracks." But the spacing was wrong for that, and we all knew it. About 200 yards from the river, we found the structure. At first, it looked like storm damage, a tangle of broken trees and branches. But as we circled it, the deliberate nature became clear. Thick branches, some nearly as thick as my thigh, had been woven and locked together in a dome-like shape. The construction stood almost 9 feet tall, with a narrow entrance facing away from the prevailing wind. Inside, the ground had been cleared to bare earth. "Probably a bear den," Chen said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Bears don't weave branches. They don't create precise geometric patterns with interlocking supports." As dusk approached, the forest grew unnaturally still. Even the constant river sounds seemed muted. That's when we heard it, a sharp crack that echoed across the valley. 2 distinct strikes, wood on wood, like someone taking a baseball bat to a tree trunk. A few seconds later, an answering knock came from the ridgeline to our west, then another from the north, fainter but unmistakable. "Branch falling," muttered Chen, but he was already packing his gear. Some of the younger rangers forced laughs, making jokes about Bigfoot's Morse code. But I noticed how quickly they moved, how their eyes kept scanning the tree line. Mike Reeves, a veteran ranger who'd been quietly taking soil samples all afternoon, pulled me aside as we headed back to the vehicles. 23 years in these woods," he said softly, "and I've never seen construction like that. Not from bears, not from storms, not from anything we've got documented." He glanced over his shoulder, then added, "There's places I won't go alone, anymore. Not since last spring. The forest, it remembers who steps wrong. Sounds crazy, but you spend enough time out here, you learn to listen when it warns you." The knocking followed us all the way back to the trucks, growing louder as darkness settled. None of us mentioned how the patterns seemed to be herding us, pushing us toward the road with steady percussion from 3 sides. We maintained radio silence the whole way back, but I could see the relief on every face when the station lights finally came into view. 3 days after our ground search concluded, we received a formal summons to the Regional Forest Service office in Bethel. The morning was crisp, frost coating the helicopter's windscreen as we made our way there. I remember adjusting my collar, trying to look as professional as possible despite the sleepless nights that had followed our encounter. The office was a stark contrast to the wilderness we'd been operating in. Fluorescent lights, the whir of desktop computers, and the artificial warmth of central heating. Deputy Regional Supervisor Matthews met us in a conference room that smelled of coffee and paper. He was a bureaucrat through and through, with wire-rimmed glasses and a demeanor. That suggested he'd rather be anywhere else. "Let's make this quick," Matthews said, sliding incident report forms across the table. "We need your statements regarding the alleged sighting on September 23, 1994. I noticed how he emphasized alleged. Our pilot, Jim, bristled visibly but kept his composure. The loadmaster, Dave, just stared at his hands. "We have the thermal footage," I said, placing our flight recorder tape on the table. "The heat signature alone—" Yes, Matthews interrupted, waving his hand dismissively. "Our wildlife division has reviewed similar recordings, usually bears standing upright, sometimes moose in poor visibility conditions. Sir," Jim leaned forward, "what we saw was neither. The movement patterns, the deliberate dragging motion. The report will note observed animal activity, details inconclusive due to weather conditions," Matthews stated, typing into his computer. "Standard procedure for unverified wildlife encounters." I watched as he logged the tape into evidence, assigning it a reference number, AK94-1023. The bureaucratic reduction of our experience to a simple code made my stomach turn. "But what about the structure we found?" Dave finally spoke up. "Those branches were woven together. No animal could—" "Natural debris accumulation," Matthews cut in. "Common in flood zones. The Rangers report already documented that. We spent the next hour filling out forms, our experience being systematically dismantled and categorized into neat little boxes that stripped away everything extraordinary about it." I noted how Matthews kept glancing at his watch, as if our presence was keeping him from more important matters. When we finished, he collected the papers with mechanical efficiency. "The tape will be reviewed by our wildlife assessment team. You'll receive copies of the final report within 30 days. Something about his tone made me uneasy. 2 weeks later, I used my clearance to check the evidence log, curious about what conclusions they'd drawn. What I found, or rather didn't find, sent a chill down my spine. There was no entry for AK94-1023, no record of our tape ever being logged into storage. I approached the records clerk, an older woman named Patricia who'd worked there for decades. "There must be some mistake," I insisted, showing her my notes with the reference number. She pecked at her keyboard, frowning. "Nothing under that number," she said. "Are you sure you wrote it down correctly?" I was positive. I'd written it in my personal logbook the day we filed the report. But according to the official system, our evidence had never existed. When I tried to follow up with Matthews, his secretary informed me he'd been transferred to a different district. No forwarding. Contact information was available. The systematic erasure of our encounter felt more disturbing than the incident itself. It was one thing to face an unknown entity in the wilderness, but quite another to watch it vanish into the machinery of bureaucracy, leaving us with nothing but our memories and the lingering question, what exactly had they wanted to hide? Thus, weeks following our meeting with Matthews changed us all in ways I couldn't have predicted. Our tight-knit crew, once known for easy banter and shared jokes during long flights, began to splinter under the weight of what we'd witnessed and the subsequent cover-up. Dave, our loadmaster, was the first to show cracks. He stopped joining us for post-flight debriefings, rushing off as soon as we touched down. When work required communication, he kept it strictly professional, speaking in clipped tones through the headset. I caught him one morning, organizing cargo manifests, and tried to broach the subject. "Dave, about what happened on the Kuskokwim." "Don't," he cut me off, hands trembling slightly as he gripped his clipboard. "Just don't. It was probably a bear, like they said, or a guy in a suit. Has to be." But his voice lacked conviction, and he wouldn't meet my eyes. Jim's transformation was more subtle, but equally concerning. Our veteran pilot, who'd always approached flying with steady confidence, began second-guessing routine decisions. He'd spend extra time checking weather reports, often finding reasons to delay flights until conditions were perfect. When we did fly, especially near the area of our encounter, his knuckles would whiten on the controls. "Notice how the radio, static gets worse through here," he mentioned once, breaking an hour-long silence. Never picked up on that before. But we both knew the static had always been there. It was Jim's perception that had changed. I couldn't let it go. Every dead end in the official records only fueled my determination. I filed Freedom of Information Act requests, contacted other Forest Service officers, even reached out to local news stations. Each attempt hit the same wall of bureaucratic silence or polite dismissal. One evening, after a particularly frustrating call with a records officer in Anchorage, Jim found me in the hangar, poring over maps of the area. "You need to stop," he said quietly, closing the door behind him. "They're watching. Yesterday, some suit from the regional office was asking about our fuel logs, flight patterns, said it was routine." "Nothing about this is routine," I argued. "The missing tape, Matthews's transfer, the way they're pretending none of it happened." "Exactly," Jim interrupted, his voice tight with anxiety. "Think about it. Either they don't know what we saw and they're covering their incompetence, or—" He trailed off, leaving the darker alternative unspoken. The tension began affecting our work. Simple tasks became complicated by unspoken fears and suspicions. Dave would triple-check his cargo calculations, as if expecting to find discrepancies. Jim started filing alternate flight plans without telling us, just in case. I caught myself, scanning the tree lines during supply drops, half expecting to see that massive figure emerge from the shadows. Our once easy camaraderie dissolved into awkward silences and forced small talk. During breaks, Dave would find excuses to eat alone, while Jim spent hours in the pilot's office, door closed, making mysterious phone calls. I overheard him one day, talking about transfer opportunities to other districts. The incident hadn't just shaken our belief in what we thought we knew about the natural world. It had eroded the trust we'd built over years of working together. Each of us carried a piece of that day's truth, but we'd stopped sharing the burden, instead letting it isolate us from one another. The calendar pages turned, and the autumn chill crept deeper into the valley. 2 weeks passed, then 3. I watched from my station as the search teams gradually thinned out, their excuses becoming more routine. "Weather's making conditions impossible," they'd say, or "no fresh leads to pursue." The lead ranger seemed almost relieved to scale back operations, citing budget constraints and approaching winter conditions in his official reports. But the whispers didn't stop. If anything, they grew more persistent. At Jerry's diner, where local trappers gathered for morning coffee, I'd catch fragments of conversations that made my skin crawl. A hunting guide mentioned how his clients refused to camp along certain stretches of the Kuskokwim now. An elderly Yupik woman spoke in hushed tones about shadows moving upright through the trees near her smokehouse. Most disturbing were the new reports trickling in. A solo kayaker who never checked in at his planned stops. 2 hikers whose trucks sat abandoned at a trailhead for 5 days before anyone reported it. The authorities treated each case as isolated incidents, exposure, misadventure, poor planning, but I noticed they all clustered along that same river bend where we'd had our encounter. I tried bringing my concerns to the ranger station. The desk sergeant just smiled tightly and handed me a standard wildlife incident form. "Bears are active this time of year," he said, not meeting my eyes. When I mentioned our missing video footage, he suddenly became very interested in his computer screen. The pattern was becoming clear. Every attempt to discuss what we'd seen met the same wall of polite deflection. Official channels preferred their neat explanations. Animal activity, weather events, human error. Anything but acknowledgement of what that thermal imaging had shown. Us. Even the local newspaper buried these disappearances in brief notices on back pages. No connection was drawn between them. No mention made of our helicopter report or the ground search that followed. It was as if some unspoken agreement existed to maintain silence, rather than face questions no one wanted to answer. What I haven't told anyone, not even my former crew members, is that I made a copy of the footage before surrendering the original. Tape. It wasn't protocol. Hell, it could have cost me my job. But something deep in my gut told me to preserve what we'd captured that day. I kept the duplicate hidden in an old flight log case, untouched for weeks after the incident. Late 1, Night, when sleep wouldn't come, I finally worked up the courage to watch it again. My hands trembled as I set up the old VHS player in my home office. The timestamp in the corner read 16:37 hours, 4:37 in the afternoon, but the fog and overcast sky made it seem later, darker. The footage was exactly as I remembered, yet somehow worse. Through the thermal imaging, the figure's heat signature blazed against the cool gravel bar. I kept rewinding, pausing, squinting at the grainy images. At marker 3 minutes and 12 seconds, there was a frame, just one frame, where everything aligned. The mist thinned, the angle was right, and you could make out the silhouette with horrifying clarity. I've studied that frame hundreds of times now. The broad shoulders, the impossible height, at least 8 feet, maybe more. But it's the other detail that keeps me up at night. Dangling from its grip, unmistakable even through the thermal distortion, was what appeared to be a human leg. The limb hung limp, swaying as the figure moved, the heat signature already fading to match the ambient temperature. Sometimes, I tell myself it was a deer carcass, or maybe a bear dragging a moose. The rational part of my brain desperately searches for explanations that fit within the natural order of things. But then, I remember the way it moved. Fluid, purposeful, aware. No animal I've ever encountered carries its prey like that. No man could have managed that burden with such ease. The footage sits in my safe now, along with my notes and maps. Some nights I'm tempted to release it, to force the truth into the open. Other nights, I remember the lead ranger's words about some things being kept quiet for a reason. I'm still not sure which instinct to trust. The years since that encounter have carved different paths for each of us. Mike, our loadmaster, quit aviation altogether within 6 months. Last I heard, he'd moved to Arizona, as far from Alaska's wilderness as he could get while staying in the States. He never discussed what happened that day again, just packed up and vanished like morning mist off the Kuskokwim. Tom, our pilot, took a darker route. The bottle became his closest companion, and that sharp mind that once navigated treacherous weather with ease grew clouded with bitterness. He'd corner people at bars, trying to tell our story, until even his oldest friends started avoiding him. He passed away 5 years ago, still haunted by what we saw. As for me, I've carried this burden quietly, letting it settle into the background of my life like the constant hum of rotor blades. Some nights, when the wind howls just right, I find myself back in that cockpit, watching that massive figure disappear into the tree line. The thermal footage sits in my desk, a ghost in digital form, reminding me that some mysteries refuse to be filed away and forgotten. I've learned that the Alaskan wilderness holds secrets deeper than weather patterns and wildlife migrations. Those vast stretches of untamed forest don't just conceal, they protect. Rivers can wash away evidence, and dense undergrowth can swallow structures whole. But sometimes, just sometimes, something slips through. A glimpse, a frame of footage, a memory that defies explanation. To those who dismiss every disappearance with convenient explanations, animal attacks, exposure, accidents, I say this: there are things in this world that exist beyond our comfortable categories. I've seen one with my own eyes, captured it on film, and watched as official channels erased it from existence. The truth is out there, recorded in thermal greens and whites, but some truths are better left in the shadows where they belong. Not every mystery needs solving. Not every dark corner needs light. Sometimes, the most important knowledge is simply knowing when to turn the helicopter around and leave the forest to its secrets. Thank you for being part of this moment. I'll be here tomorrow, ready to share another story that comforts the soul.